Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to the Sabbat Worlds Crusade, where Warmaster Makaroth's large-scale general offensive has gotten off to a very good start indeed. Last time, we covered several standout successes, along with an occasional failure. But on the grand scale, the victories by far outnumbered the defeats. Even if some actions required supreme efforts to see the Imperium secure the day. The world of Prasarius is one such example. Another hive world, and this time an ancient one, with cavernous, enormous underhives. The world had been a major production hub that had been using a tremendous population of abhuman slaves, mutants in essence, to fuel the world's forges. This detritus of civilized society had eked out a continuous living deep down in the underhives, where the true masters and rightful owners of Prasarius, the pure-blooded humans, paid them little mind. Such a state of affairs is of course only natural and correct. But the mercy of the humans in allowing the abhuman population to remain unpurged, and even in their infinite kindness allow the filthy mutant an opportunity to earn a minute measure of the God Emperor's grace by laboring away in his factoriums, it opened the humans up to betrayal most vile, as the mutant is ever a devious creature, and unbeknownst to the beneficent humans above, the creatures in the underhive were growing malcontent. Until one day, they could no longer see their labors in the forges for what they were. Nobly granted opportunities from their betters to purify a small portion of their twisted, misbegotten souls through servitude to the God Emperor, but instead started to see their labors as oppressive, as slavery. And in their misled blindness, they saw the outsiders, chaos preachers and infiltrators, not as an insidious threat to their very eternal souls themselves, but, of all things, as liberators. Thus deceived, billions upon billions of mutants rose up from the underhives to wash the streets of the hives of Prasarius with the blood of their betters. Obviously, such a betrayal, most base and vile, could not be forgiven, even in the spirit of Prasarius's previous beneficent rulers. And so the Imperial Guard force dispatched by Macarius to retake the world was accompanied by a sizable contingent of the Iron Snakes chapter of the Adeptus Astartes. The God Emperor's Angels of Death would come to teach the mutant just how good they'd had it. The Iron Snakes were gaining quite the reputation for their abilities in handling the scum of the archenemy across the Sabbat worlds. And they were going to earn every bit of that reputation on Prasarius, as they delved deeper and more aggressively into the underhives than any other Imperial force. Their zeal obviously grants them great honor, but some might argue that they were delving a little bit too deeply and greedily for their own good. as the Iron Snakes were on multiple occasions cut off from the rest of the invading Crusader forces. And as we have seen previously during the battle for Balhut, for example, whilst the mighty Space Marines are most assuredly the finest spearhead in the Imperium, even the mightiest of spear tips are of little use without a solid haft behind it. During the worst periods of their separation, the Iron Snakes were cut off by a massed, mechanized force of mutants. Presumably they had taken the knowledge imparted so generously upon them by the good people of Pressarius to create their own crude mockery of the Imperium's war machines and motorized vehicles. Launching a counterattack, they severed the spear, burying the Iron Snakes in their bodies and separating them from the rest of the crusading force. For 9 whole days, the Sons of Ithaca fought without rest and without resupply against overwhelming numbers. Running dry of all supplies, they fought with bare hands and unpowered blades, bludgeoning mutants to death with chainswords that had long run dry of power cells as well as teeth, impaling them upon the glorious, famed spears of Ithaca, once wreathed in power fields now long extinguished. And when even these things failed, they simply proceeded to crush skulls with bolter butts and armored fists, until at long last the subterranean hordes broke and scattered before them, and the Sons of Ithaca secured perhaps their finest triumph in the entire crusade. Though their heroics came at a cost. 39 battle brothers would never again march to war in the God Emperor's name, and the loss of nearly half a company of the Emperor's angels is an exorbitant cost to pay for the crushing of mere mutant scum. But still, Pressarius was a triumph for the Crusade and the Iron Snakes. However, the honeymoon phase of Makaroth's grand offensive was beginning to come to a close. Initially, the Chaos forces had been scattered, demoralized and defeated at Balhut, and Makaroth's series of rapidly escalating assaults had taken maximum advantage of the enemy's confusion. But deeper inside the Sabbat worlds, chaos still reigned supreme, as we could see with the final fall of the Forge world of Urdesh in 767. This was the premier Forge world in the entire Sabbat worlds area, and its loss would see the enemy's forces be significantly reinforced with its war materiel, including large quantities of tanks and armored vehicles. Not to mention significant additional reserve forces that had been busy reducing resistance on Urdesh deep behind their own lines. And this was far from the only major blow to the Crusade in 767. It also saw the death of one of the highest-ranking leaders in the Imperial Crusade, Lord Militant Hector Dravir, who had not only been a potential candidate for War Master at the onset of the Sabbat Worlds Crusade, but had been yet again another one of the key contenders for the title upon Slado's death. Now, the passing of this particular Lord Militant is a slightly more complex topic, of course. So we will, before moving on to that, talk about perhaps the single largest disaster in the Crusade to date. And it happened, of course. Makaroth's detractors will be quick to remind you and everyone else willing to listen under his auspices. I speak, of course, of the devastating defeat at Parthenope. In the War Master's rush to secure territory and position, you see, there was also a third objective, and that was to further shatter the Chaos Horde. Obviously, Archon Nadzibar had underneath him an entire cadre of commanders, a twisted echo of the high command of the Imperial Guard and the crusading forces. Due to their exalted status and their obvious value to the enemy's command and control system, the capture and execution of these individuals were a high priority, and one of them, Qux of the Eyeless, was tracked to the world of Parthenope. If it was indeed Qux, then here was an opportunity for the Imperium to deal a crushing blow to one of the foremost Magisters of the Old Archon, as he had garnered himself quite a reputation during the initial chaos subjugation of the Sabbat worlds, and Imperial intelligence was quite convinced that it was indeed him, as his forces had raided 2 other worlds during their retreat, Rodolph Magnus and Hermia. Reports gathered from these worlds about the nature of the opposition, their behavior and their insignia seemed to make it clear beyond all reasonable doubt that it was the Magister. Imperial intelligence further asserted that he was more than likely going to ground on Parthenope to take stock of his forces and his position. As, remember, of course, the Magister was in essence fleeing the defeat at Balhut. This was not so much an organized raiding force or even really an orderly withdrawal as it was a head-over-heels flight, but one that must be pursued with vigor and determination so as to not allow it to congeal again into a proper fighting threat. Or at the very least, that was the assessment of Imperial intelligence. Electing to not take any chances, however, a significant Imperial Guard contingent was dispatched to the planet, 80 regiments under the command of General Onator. Some 250,000 men with logistical personnel and everything else included. It was a considerable force to bring one man to justice, but with chaos, one should never take any chances. Furthermore, the Imperial Guard elements were also escorted by a sizable contingent of the Imperial Navy, including several capital vessels and a follow-on Adeptus Mechanicus force as well. Upon arriving at Parthenope, it was made immediately obvious that the Magister was readying himself for a fight. His troops were deployed down on the surface on the outskirts of vast highlands. No doubt an orbital strike was considered, but with the army in its current position, it would be all too easy for it to simply disengage and flee into the countless gorges and ravines of the highlands behind them. The Imperial Navy could have scored some serious damage upon the force, but they could in no way have annihilated it, nor could they have been certain of actually killing the Magister. Thus, General Ontar made the decision to deploy his 250,000 men down to the surface of the world and take the Magister's challenge on in person. And by all reasonable standards, it was the correct choice. The Imperium had a crushing force majority. It had one of the enemy's greatest generals trapped in front of them, and aforementioned general was in all due likelihood in command of a disorganized and demoralized force. The great defeat at Balhut had no doubt sent shockwaves down the Chaos command lines, and seeing as the Chaos forces tended to be far more ideologically devoted to their leaders and the Imperial Guard, the death of as prominent a leader as Archon Nadzibar should have had serious consequences for the enemy forces. Thus, when the enemy began to break and flee into the highlands under the weight of the Imperial Guard's battering advance, nothing seemed amiss. And so when General Onotor ordered the pursuit of the fleeing Chaos forces, his greatest mistake was not overconfidence, it was not the boldness of the pursuit. If anything, if any error was truly made on behalf of General Onotor, it was that he followed an orthodox strategy in the face of an unorthodox opponent, as what appeared to be a retreat was in fact a carefully orchestrated ruse, as Kyuk's forces fell back into the highlands and dispersed themselves amongst the countless ravines and gorges, using the terrain to hide their troop movements, their numbers and their positions. This, incidentally, would have been an impossible operation without massive amounts of preparation. The exact number of the Chaos forces is, classified. But considering the sheer scope and scale of the Imperial Guard formations sent against him, it seems quite likely that the Chaos forces would have been in the realms of 400,000 to 600,000 strong. As generally speaking, the Imperium is more than happy to engage Chaos cultist forces with a disadvantage of 3-1, and still feel very confident in victory, as cultists simply cannot stand up to professional fighting men, not in discipline, not in morale, not in the handling of their weaponry, or in their capabilities of maneuvering across the battlefield. So it is a practical certainty that the Manchester had a lot more raw manpower than Onotar had. This again should not have worried the general at all, and evidently it did not. But the crafty Manchester had managed to create a scheme that would see his forces dispersed near perfectly across the highlands. Again, something that would have required weeks, at the very least, probably months of planning and preparation. Even then, it would be on a tight schedule, spreading hundreds of thousands of men over virtually any area, and then be able to bring them back together on short notice, not to mention keeping them supplied with ammunition, food, water, and so on. Would be a logistical nightmare. It might be giving the enemy a little bit too credit, almost as dangerous a thing as giving them too little, but it seems rather likely to me that Manchester Quicks had probably seen this planet years ago. He had seen the ground, and he had foreseen the scenario in which he could use it to the maximum effect. General Onotar was just the unlucky commander who drew the short straw, and thus ended up as little more than the Manchester's victim. As the Imperial Guard regiments forged on into the highlands, armor, mechanized elements, artillery, and infantry all, they found no sight of any organized resistance, just yet further fleeing masses, exactly what they would expect. Any Imperial tactician would provide the exact same advice in such a scenario: pursuit at the maximum speed to track down and destroy the enemy before he has a chance to reorganize himself. General Onotar did just that, and as the forces forged deeper into the highlands, their flanks began to come under attack. Initially, these reports would probably have been more or less ignored. Scattered bands of local resistance, Chaos troops that had grown tired of running and were now resigned to a last desperate stand, or elements that had become so separate that they had moved to the sides of the larger formations. Nothing to worry about, happens in pursuit scenarios all the time. Then the frequency of these reports increased. And yet further reports came of Chaos forces assaulting the Imperials' rear lines, attacking artillery gun emplacements, launching ambushes on the rearward columns over land that had already been swept by the guardsmen. More worrying still, resistance to the column's front was beginning to stiffen and coalesce. More and more enemy formations were seemingly turning around, or receiving reinforcements from hidden troops deeper in the highlands. The first vague outlines of an enormous, carefully prepared pincer maneuver was beginning to reveal itself to General Onotar, who immediately made the again only correct decision in ordering a full-scale fighting withdrawal before their lines of retreat could be cut off completely. But getting 250,000 men, with trucks, tanks, APCs, guns, artillery of all caliber, and the infantry themselves to turn around and move in the opposite direction is no easy feat. Especially not with God Emperor only knows how many hundreds of thousands of screaming heretics barreling down against you. And these heretics were far better equipped and prepared than the general had expected, too. With the speed at which they were cutting his forces off, they had clearly hidden significant motorized reserves and artillery in the highlands as well. The Imperial Guard columns, moving backwards as swiftly as they possibly could, headed towards a pair of major mining towns just outside of the highlands. These towns, Toronon and Selask, would hopefully provide the Imperials with just enough time and fortification to begin reorganizing their lines. The rear guard, now the forward elements, would rush there, in the hopes of setting up a commanding position through which the rest of the columns could then retreat and reform behind them to re-engage the enemy in a pitched battle, in which case the Imperium might very well be able to regain the advantage. But getting to that point was going to be a major problem. The Imperial Guard forces had divided themselves into countless columns snaking across the highlands for simple geographical regions. You're dealing with a vast area filled with hills and ravines and gorges. You can't move 250,000 men over terrain like that in a single enormous mass. Again, normally this wouldn't be a concern. The Imperial Guard's Vox systems should have been able to keep contact between the various columns with little problem. If any one was attacked, the next column would only be at most half an hour away to lend aid, and even further columns shortly thereafter. It was a miniature of the Imperium's doctrine of proportioned response, and would work quite well unless, of course, all of those countless columns were in a state of absolute disorder and disarray, like, for example, when 250,000 men are ordered to turn around and head in the opposite direction. Command and control quickly began to collapse, as then also panic set in as the soldiers began to realize what was happening. Officers were attempting to keep control as best they could, but they too did not have a clear view of what was happening. The communications lines would have been swamped within hours at most of reports, of people calling for instructions, of officers requesting orders, of officers requesting updated intel, of scout teams attempting to relay information about the enemy's positions, about battery commanders asking for targets, or if what they're shooting at are actually enemies or Imperial Guard forces retreating. There was no guarantee now that a call for aid would even be heard, much less so responded to, and even less so again responded to in time. Which resulted in several columns being entirely cut off from the rest of the army, and in many cases cut off to the point of absolute confusion and inaction. Like what happened to the Samothrace 4th, the 2nd Mennonites, and the 23rd and 26th Baldikian Fusiliers. This column, having formed itself into the rough equivalent of an ad hoc division, found itself cut off by Chaos forces and attacked on all sides. Seeing no other option, the column's officer would obviously have tried to break away from the enemy encircling them, finding a weakness to strike out against. And they did find such a weakness. Launching counterattacks in an attempt to break through, the column found itself entrapped, heading directly towards a gorge. Seeing no other opportunity, the officers ordered the ad hoc division formation to make their way into the gorge, providing immediate cover from the enemy and hopefully a way out. But this was simply yet another of the countless pre-prepared traps that the Eyeless had laid for the Imperium's brave troops. Now bottled up, 10,000 men had nowhere to go. Their only way back out, a narrow gorge exit now completely surrounded by Chaos troops, bringing up heavy artillery batteries. Over the course of the next 5 hours, they were bombarded at point-blank range, without any cover, without any concealment, with nowhere to run. In a kill zone. No, a slaughtering yard. Over the course of the next following days, General Onator was desperately trying to pull his retreating columns back to the relative safety of the mining towns, and what was to be soon a newly established defensive line. But his forces were being picked apart for every step they took, and it would require a small miracle for the force to reach its objective intact. A miracle that seemingly the Adeptus Mechanicus were ready and able to provide, as they sent messages down to General Onator that they would be deploying their own forces in support of him, now that they saw a pressing enough need for it. The first to reach the world were several cohorts of Admech Skitarii. They would rush forward to aid the retreating columns. Heavier Admech support elements would follow as soon as possible, including battle servitors and god machines. Titans would walk the earth on Parthenop. Surely their mighty firepower would be more than enough to overwhelm anything the traitors could throw at them. And again, under any other circumstance, this would have been the correct course of action. But once more, the Imperium was underestimating their opponent. Not only had Cooks the Eyeless created a trap for the Imperial Guard, he had created one for the Adeptus Mechanicus as well, as he unveiled several titans of his own that had been hidden expertly and with tremendous care and caution in the Highlands. If you think concealing hundreds of thousands of cultists was an achievement, this was an amazing feat of strategic deception. The mere power signature alone of a god machine could easily be detected from orbit. Unless, of course, the correct rituals of calming and obeisance had been made to the machines. These usually take days, weeks, months even. It takes hours or possibly days merely to rouse a machine to war. It takes even longer to calm one down, especially a Chaos Titan. In essence, a city block-sized demon engine. To manage to keep these quiet enough to not be detected would have required not merely massive preparations and rituals, but probably incredible sacrifices as well. And to keep them quiet still, even whilst a war was being waged nearby, was a truly tremendous feat. And then to bring them online just when they needed to, before the Chaos forces could take serious casualties from the enemy's god machines. The scale of the plan put in motion here, well, genius is simply too banal a word for it. What followed then were 9 days of desperate fighting and constant staged withdrawals for the Imperial Guard and their new Adeptus Mechanicus allies. Every defensive line they tried to throw up was quickly circumnavigated or simply overrun by the enemy's numbers. And slowly, even the god machines were overwhelmed, the Skitarii cohorts fighting to the last man to defend their fallen gods. But it was hopeless. General Onotor and the last of his men fought to the bitter end as well, knowing that there would be no surrender in the face of this foe. There would be no mercy. And those pitiful few who were taken as captives faced a fate far worse than any death that could have been bestowed upon them by gun or shrapnel or bombardment. Certainly, some form of evacuation was probably attempted, but with the enemy constantly pushing in on the guard forces' necks, there would have been no opportunities to begin lifting any significant number of troops off the surface of the planet. Certainly no opportunity to try and retrieve the god machines, each one requiring hours or weeks of rituals and massive landers, which would have been easy prey to the enemy's advancing heavy guns. And finally, to make the disaster complete, enemy fleet elements began to emerge as well, as the third layer of the trap began to close around the neck of the Imperial force. With the annihilation of the Guard and the Adeptus Mechanicus, the Hedwak fleet came for the Imperial Navy. 20 mass conveyance transports were destroyed. Several capital vessels and an unknown number of escorts were also lost. Finally, in the wake of the catastrophe, the Imperial Navy and Guard began to tally their losses, with the clinical, cold, bureaucratic efficiency of a military machine that had just faced defeat. The list counting the void-born losses of the Imperial Navy alone covered 14 pages of the report. And it was only ever partially acknowledged by Imperial Crusade Command. The Imperial Guard casualties were practically complete. Only a handful of measly survivors managing to get back to orbit aboard the various evacuation vessels. And only a handful of those again managed to leave the system on a void-capable vessel, without being hunted down and destroyed by the roving Hedwak fleets. It was blindingly obvious, long before the final account was even close to complete, that this was by far the biggest and most telling defeat suffered by the crusading forces in over a decade of war. And Makaroth privately and silently hoped it would be the largest loss he ever faced in the war, because he could ill afford another Parthenop. Even more so than the War Master ever truly suspected, as there were also moves being made against him from inside the ranks of the Imperial Guard. Some of his highest commanders were readying actions against him on a military level, and Parthenop might just have given them the excuse to do so overtly, without the need for more subtle or treacherous tactics. But this is another heavily suppressed and extremely secret occurrence, the likes of which even high-ranking inquisitors will need to leap through quite a few hoops to get access to, particularly as it included the unfortunate actions of a fellow inquisitor. This would be a significant and constant problem for the God Emperor's most holy orders throughout the entirety of the Sabbath Worlds Crusade, as the enemy had it is shameful to say, managed to infiltrate even my holy orders on a level rarely ever before seen in the Imperium's history. But the tale of Monthax and Inquisitor Haldane will be the topic for next week's video. Until then, I have been Arch. Thank you all very much for listening, and I do hope to see you all again soon. Have a good day.